The sun beat down mercilessly on the stockade, its rays glaring off the raw pine logs that formed the towering walls. Inside, thousands of men shuffled weakly through red Georgia mud, their faces gaunt, their uniforms in tatters. The stench of rot and human waste clung to every breath. A shallow stream, meant to supply water, trickled sluggishly through the middle of the compound, fouled by sewage upstream. Men bent over it anyway, desperate for a drink. Flies buzzed over open sores, and the groans of the sick carried across the crowded pen. Andersonville, officially called Camp Sumter, was never meant to hold this many prisoners, but in 1864 and 1865 it became the most infamous Confederate prison camp of the Civil War. Inside its walls, tens of thousands of Union soldiers endured hunger, disease, and despair, with thousands never making it out alive. The prison was established in February 1864 near the small town of Andersonville, Georgia. At first, it was a solution to a problem that plagued both sides: how to house the swelling number of captured soldiers. Prisoner exchanges between Union and Confederate forces had broken down, leaving camps overflowing. The Confederacy chose Andersonville because of its remote location, abundant timber, and a rail line that connected it to the rest of the South. The stockade, built of pine logs set vertically in the ground, was intended to hold 10,000 men. By the summer of 1864, it held more than 30,000. The overcrowding was staggering. Inside the 16-acre enclosure, prisoners were packed shoulder to shoulder with little space to move. There were no proper shelters provided. Men tore up their blankets to rig crude tents called shebangs, or dug shallow holes in the earth to escape the blistering sun and pounding rains. Food was scarce and of miserable quality: coarse cornmeal, a few beans, sometimes rancid bacon if the supply trains came through. The Confederate Army itself was short on rations, but prisoners received even less. Starvation and malnutrition quickly became evident in the hollow cheeks and swollen bellies of men who had once been soldiers in fighting trim. Disease spread like wildfire. The camp's single water source, a small stream that flowed through the middle of the stockade, was fouled almost immediately. Men upstream used it to wash, cook, and relieve themselves. By the time it reached the prisoners further down, the water was contaminated. Dysentery, diarrhea, and scurvy swept through the camp. Without medicine or sanitation, men wasted away. By August 1864, more than 100 prisoners a day were dying, their bodies lined up by the dead gate, waiting to be hauled out and buried in shallow trenches beyond the walls. Discipline inside the prison was harsh. A line known as the Deadline was marked around the inner edge of the stockade, about 20 feet from the walls. Any prisoner who crossed it risked being shot instantly by guards stationed in wooden sentry towers above. The guards, often poorly trained and resentful conscripts, enforced the rule without hesitation. Escape attempts were rare. Digging tunnels was nearly impossible under constant watch and in such crowded conditions. Those who tried were usually discovered and punished brutally. The commandant of Andersonville was Captain Henry Wirtz, a Swiss-born officer in the Confederate Army. Wirtz oversaw the camp during its worst months. He claimed his hands were tied, that shortages, disease, and the collapse of Confederate resources left him unable to provide for the prisoners. To Union survivors, however, Wirtz was remembered as cruel and indifferent, enforcing strict punishments while thousands died under his watch. After the war, he would become one of the only Confederates tried and executed for war crimes. Life inside the stockade tested every form of human endurance. Men who had once fought bravely at Antietam, Gettysburg, or Chickamauga now struggled simply to stay alive another day. Some clung to comradeship, sharing scraps of food or helping the sick. Others preyed on their fellow prisoners. A gang known as the Andersonville Raiders roamed the camp, beating and robbing weaker men of rations or valuables. In July 1864, prisoners organized their own trial, convicting several raiders and hanging them inside the stockade with the approval of Confederate authorities. It was one of the few moments where prisoners took justice into their own hands, trying to impose some order in the chaos. Amid the misery, a small event gave prisoners hope. One night, after a heavy storm, a spring burst forth inside the stockade, its water running fresh and clean. Prisoners rushed to drink from it, calling it Providence Spring. Many believed it was an act of divine intervention, a miracle that saved lives in the darkest days of the camp. Even today, the spring is remembered as one of the few bright spots in Andersonville's grim history. As the war dragged on, conditions only worsened. By September 1864, General William Tecumseh Sherman's armies were advancing through Georgia, and Confederate authorities began transferring prisoners to other camps. Still, thousands remained until the war's final months. By the time Andersonville was liberated in May 1865, more than 45,000 Union soldiers had been imprisoned there. Nearly 13,000 of them had died, victims of starvation, disease, exposure, and neglect. The horrors of Andersonville left a deep mark on those who survived. Survivors' testimonies shocked the nation. Photographs taken shortly after liberation showed skeletal men barely able to stand, their eyes sunken, their ribs visible through thin skin. These images circulated widely, fueling outrage and calls for justice. Captain Henry Wirtz was arrested, tried in Washington, D.C., and convicted of war crimes. Despite arguments that he was a scapegoat for broader Confederate failures, Wirtz was hanged in November 1865, his name forever tied to the suffering at Andersonville. The site itself became a cemetery for the dead, with rows of simple wooden markers eventually replaced by marble headstones. Today, Andersonville National Historic Site preserves the ground where so many suffered and died. Visitors walk past the reconstructed stockade, the Providence Spring, and the graves of thousands of Union soldiers. The silence of the place is a reminder of what happens when men are abandoned behind walls, left to starvation and disease. The prisoners of Andersonville endured one of the darkest chapters of the Civil War. They entered the stockade as soldiers, but inside the walls they became survivors, stripped of dignity, fighting not for their cause, but for another day of life. Their suffering told a story the battlefield never could, a story of neglect, cruelty, and the high cost of war paid not in victory, but in human misery. Thank you for listening to Last Post History. Subscribe for more true stories from the world at war.